The late afternoon sun bathed the small, secluded house in a soft golden light as Claire carried the last box into her new bedroom. It wasn't much, but it was hers. After the relentless noise and chaos of city life, she craved silence. Here, in this old house on the outskirts of town, she hoped to find peace. The bedroom was simple, an antique wooden bed frame with a faded quilt, a sturdy wardrobe with intricate carvings, and a small window that overlooked the overgrown backyard. Claire couldn't help but notice how still the air felt. The room was quiet, almost unnervingly so, and carried a faint, lingering chill despite the warmth of the day. Shrugging off her unease, she unpacked her belongings, arranging them carefully on the weathered nightstand and emptying clothes into the wardrobe. By the time she finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the room bathed in shadows. Claire collapsed onto the bed, letting out a tired sigh. As she lay there, she felt her body sinking into the mattress, the weight of her exhaustion pulling her into a deep sleep almost instantly. The next morning, Claire woke to the sound of birds chirping outside. She felt groggy, far more tired than she should have. Her muscles ached, as if she'd spent the night tossing and turning, though she couldn't recall any dreams. She brushed it off as moving day fatigue and went about her day, unaware of the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, like it was watching her. The house was hers now, but something about the bedroom made it feel like she wasn't alone. On her third night in the house, Claire awoke suddenly. She wasn't sure what had roused her. No sounds or disturbances seemed to linger in the stillness. Yet, an oppressive weight pressed down on her chest, and she had the distinct feeling she wasn't alone. Her eyes darted around the room, adjusting to the faint glow of moonlight seeping through the curtains. Everything appeared as it should. The wardrobe stood silent in the corner. The faint outline of the mirror hung above the dresser, and her belongings were untouched. Then she felt it, a distinct pressure at the foot of her bed, as if someone had just sat down. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The weight shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around her feet. Gathering her courage, Claire reached for the bedside lamp, her hand trembling as she flicked it on. The room flooded with warm light, but there was nothing there. The blanket lay undisturbed, the bed perfectly still. Claire's heart pounded as she scanned the room again, but everything remained in place. She rubbed her eyes and exhaled shakily, trying to convince herself it was just a vivid dream. Perhaps she had woken mid-nightmare. Turning off the light, she lay back down, her heart still racing. It was some time before she fell asleep again. The feeling of someone's presence lingering long after the room fell silent once more. The days passed uneventfully, but the nights brought growing dread. Each evening, Claire hesitated before entering the bedroom. The faint sense of unease from her first encounter had begun to morph into full-blown paranoia. One night, just as she was on the edge of sleep, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper broke the silence. It was too faint to make out words, but it was undeniably human. She bolted upright, her pulse racing, but the room was silent again. The next night it escalated. As Claire lay in bed, she heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the bed. She clutched the blanket tightly, holding her breath. The sound stopped just as suddenly as it had begun, but her nerves were already frayed. She tried to rationalize the incidents during the day, blaming exhaustion and stress. Yet, her resolve cracked when she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, darted across the wall and vanished near the wardrobe. Claire turned, but again there was nothing. The whispers became a nightly occurrence, sometimes accompanied by the sound of distant weeping. Claire began avoiding the bedroom altogether until she was too exhausted to stay awake. Her once peaceful retreat had become a prison of fear, and the weight of the oppressive presence grew heavier with each passing night. She couldn't deny it any longer. Something was in the room with her. Determined to uncover the truth, Claire began to search the room for any clue about its strange occurrences. While cleaning one afternoon, She accidentally knocked over a small box near the wardrobe. As she stooped to pick it up, her hand brushed against a loose floorboard. Curious, she pried it up and discovered an old, dust-covered journal hidden underneath. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and its pages were filled with neat, handwritten entries. The earliest dates went back over 50 years. As she skimmed through the journal, her heart sank. The entries described experiences eerily similar to her own. Unexplained whispers, sensations of being watched, and nightly visits from an entity referred to only as the guest. One chilling passage caught her attention. The guest never leaves. It waits in the quiet, feeding on fear. It belongs to this room and claims its occupants as its own. Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The journal provided detailed instructions for a cleansing ritual, but its final entry was smudged and unreadable. She closed the journal with trembling hands, realizing she was not the first to confront this terror. And if she didn't act, she wouldn't be the last. That night, Claire sat on the edge of her bed, the journal open on her lap. The instructions for the ritual were simple but ominous. Burn sage, recite the chant, and hold firm in the face of the guest's resistance. She gathered her supplies, her hands shaking as she prepared. As the clock struck midnight, she began. The first few moments were calm, the soft crackling of the sage filling the room with its earthy scent. But as soon as she started the chant, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature plummeted, and the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. The guest was angry. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to thicken, pooling together and stretching toward her. Claire forced herself to keep chanting, her voice wavering but determined. Then, in the mirror above the dresser, a figure began to take shape. It was a tall, shadowy silhouette, its hollow eyes fixed on her. "I won't let you stay," Claire whispered, more to herself than to the entity. The figure in the mirror tilted its head, as if amused, and began to move closer. Claire's resolve wavered, but she held her ground. The true battle was only beginning. The air grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. Claire's voice wavered as she repeated the chant, her eyes locked on the mirror. The guest's form was now fully visible, a dark, humanoid shape with hollow, gaping eyes and elongated limbs. It pressed its hands against the mirror's surface, as though trying to break through. Suddenly, the entire room seemed to come alive. The wardrobe doors slammed open and shut. The mirror trembled violently on the wall, and objects flew off the dresser. A loud, guttural growl echoed through the room, drowning out Claire's voice. She stumbled but didn't stop chanting. The journal's instructions had warned her. The guest would fight back with everything it had. The figure lunged at her, its form flickering between the mirror and the space beside her bed. Claire felt a cold hand brush against her arm, sending a jolt of icy pain through her body. "Leave this place," she screamed, her voice breaking through the entity's growls. She lit the final bundle of sage, holding it high as she recited the chant one last time. The figure let out an ear-piercing shriek, its hollow eyes flaring with a blinding light. The room shook violently, and then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The air cleared, the temperature rose, and the oppressive weight lifted. The guest was gone. Claire collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion. The battle was over, but the silence that followed felt far from comforting. The next morning, Claire woke to an unfamiliar feeling, peace. The room was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, it felt empty. She spent the day packing her belongings, eager to leave the house and its dark memories behind. Though she felt relief, a lingering unease remained. The guest was gone, but its presence had left an indelible mark on her. She avoided looking at the mirror, unable to shake the memory of those hollow eyes staring back at her. As she loaded the last of her belongings into her car, she glanced back at the house. It looked so ordinary in the daylight, almost welcoming. But she knew better. She wouldn't return, and she hoped no one else would make the same mistake. Before leaving, Claire took one last look at the bedroom. The air felt still, as if holding its breath. Her eyes drifted to the mirror, now spotless and clear. She stepped closer, her reflection staring back at her. But then she noticed something strange. Her reflection smiled faintly, a small, knowing grin. Claire's own lips remained still. Her blood ran cold as she backed away, the truth sinking in. The guest hadn't been banished. It was waiting, biding its time, and it had found a new way to stay. Claire fled the house without looking back, but the faint smile in the mirror lingered in her mind, a chilling reminder. The guest never leaves. Alex pushed open the door to his new apartment, its hinges creaking in protest. The space was modest, a small living room connected to a tiny kitchen, a single bathroom, and the bedroom. It wasn't much, but it was all he could afford after the breakup. The silence felt heavy, but for Alex, it was a welcome change. He needed time to heal, and this apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. The bedroom was the most inviting part of the apartment. The queen-sized bed sat in the middle of the room, its gray comforter neatly folded. A sleek, black bedside table held a simple lamp, and large blackout curtains hung over the window, promising restful sleep. The room was plain, but Alex appreciated the minimalism. No clutter, no reminders of his past life. After unpacking the last box, he sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long sigh. The breakup had taken a toll on him, leaving a hollow ache in his chest that he carried everywhere. As he lay back, the mattress felt firm but comfortable. For the first time in weeks, Alex felt like he could relax. The first night passed quietly, the city sounds muted by the thick curtains. When he awoke the next morning, the light was dim, and the digital clock on the bedside table read 8 a.m. He felt groggy, more tired than when he'd gone to bed. Dismissing it as first-night jitters in a new place, Alex stretched and got up to start his day. But as he left the bedroom, a strange thought lingered in his mind. Why did the bed feel so warm on one side? The second night in the apartment was much like the first, quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of distant traffic and the occasional creak of the old building were the only sounds. Alex lay in bed, scrolling through his phone until his eyes grew heavy. Eventually, he turned off the lamp and settled into the darkness. At some point in the night, he woke suddenly, his eyes opened to pitch blackness, and his body felt unusually stiff. Something was off. There was a warmth beside him, like the presence of another person lying in bed. His pulse quickened as he reached out cautiously, but his hand met only empty sheets. Fumbling for the lamp, he flicked it on. The light illuminated the room, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But when he looked down, his stomach dropped. The mattress had a slight indentation on the side opposite him, as if someone had been there. Alex stared for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe the mattress hadn't settled yet. Shaking his head, he tried to laugh it off. He had been under a lot of stress lately, and his mind was probably playing tricks on him. He straightened the covers and lay back down, forcing himself to focus on his breathing. Eventually, he drifted off again, but the feeling of warmth lingered in the back of his mind. By the third night, Alex was beginning to dread going to bed. The strange warmth and the feeling of not being alone were hard to shake. Still, he told himself it was nothing, just his imagination running wild in the new environment. Exhausted, he climbed into bed and turned off the light. Sleep didn't come easily. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with thoughts of work, the breakup, and now the unsettling sensation that something wasn't right. Just as he started to drift off, a faint sound broke the silence, breathing. Alex froze, his eyes snapping open. It was soft but steady, the unmistakable rhythm of someone lying beside him. His heart pounded in his chest as he listened, each breath growing louder in the quiet room. Gathering his courage, he shot up and switched on the light. Once again, the room was empty. The breathing had stopped, but the heavy air remained. He glanced at the bed and felt a wave of nausea. The indentation was back, deeper this time. It was as if someone had been lying there moments before. Panic began to set in. He checked the door and windows, all locked securely. Alex sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, trying to rationalize what was happening. Was he losing his mind? The thought terrified him. That night, sleep was fleeting. Every creak, Every shadow seemed to mock him, a constant reminder that he wasn't truly alone. Desperate for answers, Alex spent the next day searching the apartment for anything that could explain the strange occurrences. As he rummaged through the closet, he noticed a small, dusty box shoved into the corner. Inside, he found a worn journal with frayed edges and faded ink. Curious, Alex sat on the couch and began to read. The journal belonged to the previous tenant, someone named Ryan. The entry started innocuously enough, describing mundane details about life in the apartment. But as Alex flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. Ryan wrote about a presence he called the sleeping stranger. The descriptions matched Alex's experiences, waking up to warmth, hearing breathing, and seeing an indentation on the mattress. One passage sent chills down Alex's spine. It gets stronger over time. First, you feel it, then you see it, and by the time you realize it's not leaving, it's too late. The last entry was hastily scrawled, "I'm leaving. If you're reading this, you should too." It won't let go. Alex closed the journal with trembling hands. The weight of the warning pressed down on him, but he wasn't ready to give up his new home just yet. That night, Alex couldn't bring himself to sleep in the bedroom. He set up a makeshift bed on the couch, hoping to escape the stranger's reach. The living room felt safer, but as the hours dragged on, the unease crept back in. Around 2 a.m., he felt it again, the warmth, this time at his back. His skin prickled as he lay perfectly still, the sensation growing stronger. Alex spun around, but no one was there. The couch cushions, however, bore the unmistakable impression of another body. The stranger was following him. Alex tried everything in the following days. He rearranged the furniture, removed the bed entirely, and even slept with the lights on. Nothing worked. The presence persisted, growing more invasive each night. The once comforting solitude of the apartment had transformed into a waking nightmare. He considered leaving, but every time he tried to pack, a heavy fatigue set in. It was as if the apartment itself didn't want him to go. By now, Alex was running on fumes. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed dark circles under his eyes, a pale complexion, and a haunted expression. He couldn't keep this up much longer. On the 6th night, Alex woke to an icy hand on his arm. His eyes shot open, and he found himself face to face with the stranger. It was fully visible now, a pale, translucent figure with hollow eyes and a gaunt face. Its lips were barely parted, and when it spoke, its voice was a chilling whisper, "You belong here." Alex's body was frozen in fear, every muscle locked in place. The stranger's cold, lifeless gaze bored into him, as if peering into his very soul. The figure lay beside him, its hand unmoving, its presence suffocating. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex wrenched his arm free and scrambled for the lamp. The light flickered on, and the stranger vanished instantly, leaving behind only the lingering cold. Gasping for breath, Alex stumbled out of bed. He grabbed the journal, flipping to the cleansing ritual scrawled in the margins. He gathered salt, candles, and anything else he could find, desperate to drive the entity away. As he performed the ritual, the apartment seemed to resist. Shadows danced on the walls, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the space. The air grew thick, pressing against his chest, but Alex continued chanting. Finally, the oppressive energy lifted, leaving the apartment eerily silent. Alex collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but alive. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe. The next morning, Alex felt a tentative sense of relief. The apartment seemed lighter, the air clearer. He convinced himself that the stranger was gone, banished by the ritual. Life could return to normal. But as the day wore on, a familiar fatigue crept in. The thought of leaving the apartment felt impossible, like an invisible weight was keeping him tethered. The memory of the stranger's hollow eyes lingered, and Alex found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than he cared to admit. He wanted to believe the nightmare was over, but deep down, he knew better. Something was still there, waiting. That night, as Alex prepared for bed, he caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He froze. Behind him, faint but unmistakable, stood the stranger. Its eyes were wide open now, staring directly at him. Alex's breath hitched as a cold whisper filled the room. "You'll never sleep alone again." The light in the bathroom flickered, and when it steadied, the stranger was gone. But Alex knew it hadn't left. It never would. His reflection stared back, hollow and resigned. He turned off the light and walked into the bedroom, knowing that his fight was over. Emma stood at the front door of the old Victorian house, the key cool in her hand. The house had been a surprise inheritance from a distant relative she barely remembered. As she stepped inside, the scent of aged wood and faint lavender greeted her. The floors creaked beneath her feet, each sound echoing through the quiet halls. The house was charming in its own way. The wallpaper, though faded, carried intricate floral patterns, and the furniture seemed frozen in time. She moved through the room slowly, running her fingers over the polished wood of antique tables and cabinets. Finally, she entered the bedroom, a space both welcoming and unsettling. Dominating one wall was a large, ornate mirror framed in dark wood, its intricate carvings twisting into floral designs. It hung above a matching wooden dresser, reflecting the faint afternoon light that filtered through the lace curtains. Emma stared at the mirror for a moment. Something about it seemed off, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Pushing the thought aside, she set her suitcase on the bed and began to unpack. The room, despite its vintage charm, felt heavier than the rest of the house. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of being in an unfamiliar place. As night fell, Emma stood by the window, looking out at the quiet, tree-lined street. This house was meant to be a new beginning, a place to find peace after months of upheaval. She turned back to the bedroom, her eyes lingering on the mirror one last time before she flicked off the light. The darkness swallowed the room, leaving only her faint reflection staring back at her. Emma lay in bed, the heavy silence of the house pressing down on her. The faint rustling of leaves outside and the occasional groan of the old wood were the only sounds. She closed her eyes, trying to let the day's exhaustion pull her into sleep. Sometime after midnight, Emma woke suddenly. She wasn't sure why at first. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the curtains. She sat up, heart thudding, and that's when she heard it, a soft, muffled sobbing. It was faint but unmistakable, the kind of sound that sent a chill down her spine. She strained her ears, trying to locate its source. The sound seemed to come from within the room. Her gaze slowly shifted to the mirror. The sobbing grew slightly louder as she stared at the reflection, the room behind her appearing still and empty. Emma swallowed hard and climbed out of bed. She approached the mirror cautiously, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The sobbing continued, seeming to echo within the glass. She reached out and touched the mirror's surface. It was cool, solid. The sobbing stopped. She stood there for a moment, her breath shallow. After a few tense seconds, she shook her head, muttering to herself, "Just the house settling, or a dream." Emma climbed back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around her. But long after the house fell silent, sleep refused to come. The next few nights offered no comfort. Each time Emma tried to sleep, the sobbing returned. It grew louder, more insistent, always emanating from the mirror. She started to notice other strange occurrences. The mirror would sometimes fog up, as if someone were breathing heavily on the glass, though the room was cold. One morning, after a restless night, Emma found faint handprints on the mirror's surface. They were small, delicate, and smudged as though someone had pressed their palms against the glass and dragged them downward. She scrubbed them away, hoping that would end the haunting. But it didn't. That night, Emma was jolted awake again. She stared at the mirror, her pulse quickening. This time, she swore she saw movement. Her reflection seemed to linger a second too long after she turned her head. The figure in the mirror mimicked her, but with a delay, as if struggling to keep up. Her sleep became fractured and filled with vivid nightmares. In one dream, she stood in front of the mirror, unable to move as a woman sobbed on the other side. The woman's face was pale and tear-streaked, her eyes hollow. She reached out, her hand pressing against the glass. "Help me," she whispered. Emma woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat. She sat up in bed, clutching the blankets, her eyes darting to the mirror. It stood there, silent and reflective, but she could feel the weight of its gaze. The sense of unease clung to her like a second skin. Determined to find answers, Emma spent the next day searching the bedroom. She pulled open every drawer, examined every piece of furniture. When she tugged at the bottom drawer of the dresser, it stuck slightly before giving way, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, she found a bundle of old letters and a black and white photograph. The letters were yellowed and brittle, written in elegant handwriting. The photograph depicted a young woman with delicate features, her eyes hauntingly familiar. She looked strikingly like Emma. Emma sat on the floor, reading the letters. They were written by the woman in the photograph, addressed to a family member. The letters described a life of loneliness, confined to the house due to an unnamed illness. The woman wrote of feeling trapped, her only solace the mirror, which she called the window to my soul. The final letters became increasingly desperate, her words pleading for release. Emma felt a shiver run through her. The sobbing, the handprints, it all made sense. The spirit of this woman was trapped in the mirror, bound by her unfulfilled longing and isolation. Emma clutched the photograph tightly. "I'll help you," she whispered. That night, Emma sat in front of the mirror, the photograph and letters spread out on the dresser. She steadied her breath, trying to suppress the rising fear in her chest. "I know who you are," she said softly, her eyes locked on her reflection. "I've read your letters. I want to help." The room was silent for a long moment, and then the sobbing returned. This time, it was louder, more anguished. The mirror's surface shimmered faintly, and a shape began to form. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the pale, tear-streaked face of the woman appeared. The ghostly figure stared at Emma through the glass, her eyes pleading. Her lips moved silently at first, and then the words came, "Help me." Emma's hands trembled, but she didn't look away. "What do I need to do?" The ghost raised her hand, pressing it against the glass. Emma hesitated for a moment before mirroring the gesture, her palm meeting the cold surface. The sobbing intensified, and the mirror began to vibrate. Emma pulled her hand back, her heart racing. The woman's form faded, her mournful eyes the last to disappear. The room fell silent again, but Emma knew the spirit wasn't gone. Not yet. Emma spent the next day preparing herself. She reread the letters, focusing on the hints of a ritual mentioned in one of them. To break the mirror is to break the chain. That night, armed with a heavy candlestick, Emma stood before the mirror. The house was silent, the weight of anticipation thick in the air. Her hands shook as she raised the candlestick. She hesitated, her reflection staring back at her, mirroring her fear. "I'm doing this to set you free," she whispered. The sobbing began again, louder than ever, almost a wail. The ghost's face appeared in the mirror, her expression one of both hope and terror. The room seemed to tremble as Emma mustered the courage to strike. The first blow cracked the glass, sending spiderweb fractures across the mirror's surface. The sobbing turned into a piercing scream as the ghost's figure flickered violently, her hands pressing against the glass, trying to escape. Emma struck again, the candlestick shattering the mirror into countless shards. The scream cut off abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. The air grew still, and the room's heavy atmosphere lifted. Emma dropped the candlestick, her body trembling. She sank to her knees, staring at the shattered remains of the mirror. For the first time in days, the house felt peaceful. The next morning, the house was quiet. The once oppressive air was now light, almost welcoming. Emma walked through the rooms, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't experienced since arriving. She returned to the bedroom, her eyes falling on the broken shards of the mirror still scattered across the dresser and floor. As she gathered them carefully, she noticed how some of the fragments caught the light, shimmering faintly. For a moment, she thought she saw the ghost's face in one shard, her expression calm, at peace. Emma whispered, "You're free now." Though the spirit was gone, a part of her remained tied to the house. Emma felt it in the walls, in the air, and most of all, in the faint memories that lingered. As the weeks passed, Emma settled into her new life. The house, once a place of sorrow, had become her sanctuary. But the memory of the crying woman never fully left. One night, as Emma walked past the dresser, her gaze caught on a small shard of the broken mirror she had missed. In its reflection, for just a moment, she saw the woman's face. The ghost's eyes were calm, but there was a lingering sadness, a silent goodbye. Emma blinked, and the reflection was gone. She stood there, staring at her own face, feeling a strange mixture of peace and unease. Some reflections, she realized, never fade.